Mage 40K, Episode 5. Tell me who are you? Our crew of mages, sucked into the Warhammer 40K universe and tasked by the Emperor to, quote, fix it, found ourselves in a very weird situation, even by our standards. We had bribed the Eldar onto our side by offering a brand new virgin universe, complete with a startling lack of demons, if they played nice, and that seemed to work for everyone. Everyone except for Chegarok, the laughing god of the Harlequins, that is, who was a little miffed that we were interfering with his dastardly joke. He was willing to let us go forward with our scheme, though, so long as we did him a little favor. And so, instead of returning to our ship and our comfortable human allies, well, mostly human, we instead entered the webway and found ourselves escorted to a large room. There was a flash of light, and then we all found ourselves standing in nondescript, misty arenas by ourselves. The solitude didn't last for long, though, as each of us was soon joined by 6 individuals that looked oddly familiar. Because they were us. Chegarok, using some sort of mystic voiceover, and/or speaker system, helpfully informed everyone that we had to figure out who we were. To help with this, we were faced with 6 alternate universe variants of ourselves. 2 better, 2 worse, and 2 weird. He did not clarify what was meant by better, or weird. He did, however, clarify that there can be only one. When this didn't lead to the immediate bloodshed that was apparently expected, the Eldar divinity prompted that we had to fight, or otherwise determine, who should be the real us. Good times. While all the fights happen at the same time, we'll start with Critical, because that's how the game started. He wasn't sure how he knew, but he knew what he was dealing with. He had no idea what each of them could do in terms of specific rotes, but he had an idea of their characters. He faced a version of himself that was a megachurch preacher, a creepy bastard who heard voices, and responded, a drunkard, Critical was teetotal for personal reasons, a werewolf, a necromancer, and a version of himself with the opposite of his stellar luck. None of them were entropy fate mages like himself, so that was a stroke of fortune. Well, the necromancer did use entropy, but more in the death sense and less to do with luck and fate. Still, despite knowing that they were all strange alterations of himself, and that one of them had to be marked as the real Critical, the combatants all stood milling around and looking awkward. Finally, after much shuffling of feet, Critical Prime hollered, "Truce till we figure this out?" Most of them seemed cool with this idea, although Preacher Critical suddenly started suggesting they should purge the heretics and burn the unclean, looking meaningfully at the werewolf and the necromancer. In response, the werewolf started to growl, the necromancer started to glow, and Critical Prime sidled to the far side of the room for as much cover as the featureless place offered. The situation had all the makings of a good standoff, as everyone started channeling their powers and glancing from side to side. Then the drunk, to whom no one had been paying attention, lurched over and popped the preacher right in the jaw, although the intoxication made sure it was only a glancing blow. Still, this seemed to be the trigger to set everything off, as the preacher said a bombastic prayer to the Lord, pulled a glowing holy gun from thin air, and started blasting. The rest watched this, bemused, until the weird Critical standing off to the side mumbled, "I wonder how big a werewolf lung is," opened up a hole in space-time, reached a hand in, and pulled out a squishy organ, which he held up to a handy ruler. This definitely perturbed the werewolf, the former owner of said lung, but the way the creep stroked the organ while making uncomfortable eye contact made everyone agree, yeah, fuck that guy. Except for the preacher and the drunk, who were busy rolling around and slap fighting. Werewolf launched himself forward for a slashing attack, while Necromancer tossed some bones onto the lung and pumped magic into it, creating what he described as a lung crab, and which everyone else described as my new recurring nightmare. Unlucky pulled a scattergun. He shouted, "Don't have to be lucky with a shotgun!" But apparently you do, because he only succeeded in patterning the walls and ceiling. Blows were traded back and forth, and the creep kept trying to bad-touch people's organs, with limited success now that the Criticals knew to watch for it. After a few blows, the werewolf shouted to Critical Prime, "Would you help, you jerk?" Goaded into action, Prime popped a few of his fingers out of joint and empowered the necromancer, who proceeded to pull a bone-themed gun of his own and shoot the creep in the face. And there was much rejoicing. "Everyone else is cool with being cool, right?" asked the necromancer. Before anyone could answer, the preacher declared that the Lord had looked upon the lot of them and clearly displayed his favor through wealth, prosperity, and general hygiene, and had thus declared the drunkard lacking. And therefore the preacher was entirely justified, yea, even righteous, in shooting the drunk in the head. Which he did. Everyone else gave him a strong look, but it seemed like he was going to allow himself to be intimidated into behaving after that little outburst. Apparently it was just the poverty and grossness that caused him problems. But after that, it was decided that they should really talk out their issues. Unlucky, certain that he couldn't actually take this lot in a fight, bemoaned his lot and general lack of fortune. Prime and Necromancer, the two entropy mages, declared that they could happily give him a boost. Unlucky perked up immediately, and the two were able to buy him off with a permanent upgrade to his overall luck. He vowed to go to Vegas first thing, and was happy to let Prime remain in charge. The Necromancer had two new puppets to play with, and they both looked like him, so he stated he planned to use them to take his place in office meetings, and seemed quite pleased with the whole thing. The werewolf said he would regenerate his lung eventually, just wanted to go home, and pointedly did not mention his new pet, the lung crab currently pawing at his leg and somehow whining for uppies. No one cared what the preacher wanted, and when he started to make a noise, everyone just glared until he shut up and realized getting out alive should be considered a win for an asshole like him. Also, he really didn't want to spend any time in the 40K universe. It wasn't nice. And so Critical Prime was able to help and or appease and or kill off the other versions of himself, and maintained his place in reality. Oh, as one final note, the werewolf stated that he had been traveling with other versions of our party, fleeing an Earth that had been consumed by Kyle, the pet mimic who our fictional party in a D&D campaign had fed several dead gods, and then a universe, and which apparently was starting to leak through the multiverse. Just, as a heads up. No clue if that would be an issue for us later or not, but it was something to be aware of. Critical thanked his werewolf self for the heads up. Next up was Welshie. His variants were a lot more visually distinct, if nothing else. Again, they all knew more or less who they were through mystical nonsense. One was a medical doctor who, it seems, had had all the breaks the others missed out on. He was wealthy, successful, acclaimed, and had a loving family life. His life was perfect, and it did not need a battle with his alternate selves in a 40K universe. With a prompt, "Oh fuck all of you," he opened a portal, stepped back into his home universe, and was out of the fight. Everyone else stared awkwardly for a minute. The next unfighter was a dark necromancer Welshie, who was the laziest person ever to live. His motto was, "Why do it for yourself when zombies can do it for you?" He was actually born into the room on a palanquin by a bunch of reanimated corpses, and refused to do anything, up to and including moving off his couch. Actually, all of the Welshies had associates, coteries, or entourages with them, but Chegorok's voice told them firmly to stay out of the fight. Stadium seating spontaneously generated, and popcorn was provided. It was brain-flavored for the zombies. The vampire Welshie decided to provide his own meal, however, and lunged at the necromancer, who he declared looked deliciously rich. The lazy wizard did nothing to defend himself, but a zombie lurched from the stands to fall coincidentally in his defense. For his part, the heroic Paragon Welshie flourished his elven sword and posed, radiating confidence and magically boosting his defenses. This would have helped if any of the Welshies had tried to physically attack him. But they didn't. Instead, the Romulan-looking commander, complete with evil goatee, declared everyone reality deviants and cloaked himself. Then, reaching into his technocrat matter warper, he decided to pull an ally all of his own through scientific means. The one he got was the intrusive Critical. It seems the pair had worked together before, and Critical immediately cloaked himself before opening his horrible mystic portal into the Paragon's chest cavity. He was trying to yank out his heart, but it's dark inside a human body, and he had to settle for a lung. You know that thing where you have to use the bathroom and you kind of clench and hold it in? Yeah, that doesn't work so well in the middle of your chest. Intrusive Critical ripped the lung out, and, as the Paragon Welshie tried not to collapse, proceeded to beat the poor bastard to death with his own organ. There aren't many more humiliating ways to go. Also, you have to wonder why Chegorok didn't get involved. Probably because the god found it funny. Never trust a trickster. Seeing this, Welshie Prime decided he wanted exactly none of this bullshit. He stepped into his magic bag of holding, grabbed the bottom, and somehow pulled the bag into the dimensional warp behind him. We found out much, much later that he spent a restful few weeks bumming around Rivendell. The vampire saw the wisdom in this, and tried to do likewise, but the evil goatee Welshie pulled a hula hoop from the matter warper, tossed it lightly over the vampire, and created a portal right as it reached the creature's torso. Anyone else would just be dead, but the vampire was really determined as he dragged his torso past his legs and towards the Romulan. But, vampire or no, when your entire upper half is bottomless, you tend to bleed out pretty quickly. The necromancer grimaced, but he was determined to die as he lived, refusing to lift a finger for himself. The final Welshie was a somewhat demented one. He traveled from universe to universe destroying Pennsylvania, because he had lost a spelling bee once thinking it was named Penisvania. He was a nasty piece of work, but he wasn't organ-snatching nasty. He promptly fucked off to anywhere else, leaving the evil goatee Welshie the last one standing. He thanked his partner, returned him to the multiversal void, and assumed his place at the end of the webway maze. Over in Competence's section of the webway, our matter and spirit warping wizard was staring at a coterie of herselves. Most of them looked normal and just like her, although one had aggressively normal-looking clothing, and some odd green elongated diamond earrings. Of those dressed abnormally, one was a delivery driver of some sort, another was a pirate, and the last was clearly a Necron, but with some horrible, pulsing fungus growing out of it. Some time ago, in a campaign that was entirely fictional, we really hoped, Competence's character had been infected with sentient fungus, and eventually became a transformed devotee of the mushroom god. It seems this Competence came from a reality where that wasn't fiction, and had then been turned into a Necron. Yeah, it wasn't much of a surprise that most of the Competences ganged up on that one. You would too when you know it. Except that the ganging up was a bit strange. It seemed that Competence, in her time kicking around the Imperial Palace before the rest of us had been dragged into the universe for hijinks, had spent time with Rogel Dorn, and she had fervently adopted the idea that the best offense is a good defense. So Competence Prime summoned a moderately sized box of tungsten around herself. Fortify, fortify, fortify. Inside, she had a small padded chair, a vid screen to see outside, and a speaker system. She politely asked everyone to "fuck off, please." In response, another one of her created a slightly fancier pillbox and blared a similar call for surrender. Also, both made sure their refuges were made of material proof against radiation, and material that was a poor conductor of electricity. Take that for what you will. Deciding that the pillbox was a threat, the necro-shroom moved up to press against the material and began to glow. Until the delivery woman moved surreptitiously behind the abomination, whipped out a cardboard box, and dropped it over the shroom's head. It was the Box Lord. You see, in yet another one of our games, Competence's character had run across a number of dangerously cursed items and, lacking a better idea, had deployed that big box of do not touch. Then, the sinister thing secured, she hid it in an unknown location. This became an in-joke that she was the mysterious Box Lord, depositing all sorts of things in boxes and hiding them at the bottom of dungeons. She was the source of all loot and a force of nature. And now, she was here. Unfortunately, while cardboard has many uses, hindering a Necron in any way whatsoever is not one of them. The fungal bot gave a muffled curse, then walked firmly through the box. She turned to the Box Lord and said, "Do you mind?" Then went back to her attack on the pillbox. The Box Lord slunk away, clearly outclassed. On the other side of the room, the abnormally normal-looking Competence glowed for a moment, and then an emerald green plumb bob appeared over her head. Super Sim Competence. The pirate in the last one, not liking the look of all of this, dashed behind the metal box holding Competence Prime and did their best to cower. This was a good idea, as the concealed parties began summoning boulders, anvils, and the odd howitzer to deal with the enemy emplacements. This did very little damage, except to the Super Sim, who was fool enough to remain in the open, although she did dodge most of the attacks. The Necron just tanked most of them. You see, this Necron version of Competence was using her magical abilities to create some small holes in the pillbox and leak in some of her favorite spores. She was being nice, though, so they were only knockout spores. The pillbox Competence, who was pure evil but hadn't actually had a chance to show it yet, was no fool and crafted a breathing mask. She then gathered the spores, analyzed them, and, reaching out, filled Super Sim's lungs with the stuff. The superpowered competence didn't choke and die, as was intended, but began coughing up spores as her hyper body struggled to compensate. These spread out and hit the pirate, who was peeking out. The box lord ran around trying to put all the spores in containers, along with the coughing competence. It wasn't long before they were all snoozing peacefully on the floor. Although, before falling, the box lord had a final brilliant idea and, opting for a more abstract box, used spirit magic to blast the Necron's soul from its mechano-fungal body and close it in a spiritual box. Those with spirit magic fell asleep to the muffled cries of an irate Necron. The last remaining competence, for her part, was more sensible than most of the others. She was slightly better competence. She knocked politely on the back of Prime's cube and asked nicely to be let in. When Prime asked who she was, they compared notes quickly and, through some mystical nonsense, were able to tell that this stranger was basically the exact same as Competence Prime, except she had saved her universe's Pennsylvania from being destroyed by an irate Welshie back in the day. So just me but better. Basically, yeah. This seemed acceptable. Plus, it's hard to lie to yourself. You know your tells. So while the others were running around and being silly, Prime opened up a small door and expanded the box to accommodate the second person. Evil Competence railed at them for a while, but she kept herself entertained while Better Competence and Prime discussed things. Both being spirit mages, they came to the conclusion that this was all some sort of strange dream, and the proper application of spiritual force would fix it. So with some dual meditation, the pair summoned a wave of spiritual void, then a hefty deal of spite against uppity deities, and blanked out the entire room, with the exception of themselves. They both thought this was weird, but after some more discussion, and Chegorok getting bored of the lack of action, the two eventually combined into one. Not exactly Better Competence, more like Competence Plus. But regardless, she found herself finished with the trial, and, conveniently, Chegorok informed her that the variants that died in this trial were just sent back to their own universes. No fooling. He promised. On her part, Mills found herself surrounded with mostly normal-looking versions of herself. Well, the half of them were normal. One was a guy, but still basically the same. Then there was a cat. Not a cat person, just a regular-looking house cat. The dragon, which stood on its hind legs like a person, was a bit stranger. But the version that stood out was the one with carrots for fingers. That one reached a very dexterous foot into the pocket on the back of her calf, pulled out a phone, and started texting her friends about all these freaks with what looked like penises on their hands. A dick being the closest thing to a normal finger that this person had ever seen. Ignoring this, Mills Prime shouted out that everyone should be cool, and can't we all just get along? If we can talk this out, we can combine our powers to get everyone back to their own homes. Most of the assembled Millses nodded along with this, but one of them did summon a patch of carpet and began shuffling back and forth, building up a preemptive charge of static electricity. Still, everyone was waiting to see what would happen, until one of the women who had already looked a bit shaken finally screamed aloud, then shouted, "What are you talking about? Powers? Back home? Magic isn't real! This is all bullshit and you're just a bunch of figments of my imagination!" Then she launched herself at the lightning-focused mage, causing an anti-magic field ahead of her. This didn't actually do anything but dissolve the carpet. The electric charge, being made of actual physics, remained, and the electric mage was able to create a small stun gun made of lightning. At least, she was about to, when the enraged magic denier hit her and started flailing and scratching in panicked desperation. It was more irritating than damaging, but it was the first hostile action anyone had taken. On the other side of the room, the cat jumped on the dragon's shoulder, meowed something, and the dragon, who spoke fluent cat, launched herself into the air, landing with a ground-shaking punch that caught the anti-magic zealot a glancing blow. The cat meowed again, and the dragon helpfully informed everyone that she was calling the hostile Mills a real jerk, and saying everyone should hit her until she stopped being crazy. The male Mills moved forward a bit, crying that the attacker was clearly having mental troubles, was more sick than dangerous, and violence didn't have to be the answer. Everyone stopped to consider this for a moment, but the magic denier kept shouting and flailing about. Mills Prime tried to assist by shouting, "Look, it's fine. We can talk this out. Chill out or I will have to resort to violence. This worked about as well as any attempt to shout, calm down or I'll kill you, normally does. Finally, the cat, annoyed at the delay, took matters into her own paws. She leapt off the dragon's shoulder, turned her normally feline pounce into a classic flying dragon kick, and then, extending a claw on her foot, neatly ripped a gash in the anti-magic Mills's jugular. Kung Fu Kitty for the win. As the loud and crazy one grasped her neck, bled out, and vanished, everyone else paused to stare at the cat, keen not to annoy this lethal fighter. The cat, through the dragon, informed everyone that she came from a section of the multiverse that was being consumed by Kyle, and then, without so much as a goodbye, stepped into a shadow that hadn't been there a moment before and vanished from the room. When someone voiced their confusion aloud, Chegorok supplied the cats just kinda go where they want in any universe. After a moment, the dragon pulled out a shining scale and said, I wish, with all my heart, to adventure with that cat in a land apart, and likewise vanished. The remainder gently talked the weirded out carrots for fingers Mills into working with everyone, and they combined their mental magic into one of their phones. 5 minutes later, a nondescript sedan pulled up and said it was the multiversal Uber. With promises to send Mills Prime their share, the alternate version filed into the car and returned to their own homes. We assumed. We didn't actually check. Bard's meeting with himself was slightly less convivial, at least initially. Of his alternates, one was a virtuous paragon with superpowers. Another was a peaceful monk. Then there was a man in a regal cape and sinister-looking armor. One in an expensive suit with a flag lapel pin and a bad blonde wig. Someone who was clearly on all the drugs. And finally, an obvious necromancer. His typical robes only slightly altered by a plastic badge on a lanyard that read, Dr. Bard, Professor of Postmortem Communications, Unseen University. As the hero called out, Shazam! And was struck by a lightning bolt from nowhere, the cape figure stepped forward, arched an eyebrow, and began, Gentlemen, I believe we are all men of understanding here, and before he could get further, the besuited one interjected, I have the most understanding. Everyone says I got the biggest brain. I'm definitely the smartest guy in this room. In any room. We should all listen to me. He would have kept going, but Bard Prime gave a cry of pure disgust and fired off a psychic blast that staggered the buffoon. The follow-up soul-shredding blast from the Caped One, or Dark Lord, finished the job and the demagogue collapsed in a heap. Bard Prime kicked him until the body faded. Meanwhile, the postmortem communications professor ignored everyone, then summoned a horde of zombies to start building a stage and setting up production, while the stoner wandered around giggling. Then the Dark Lord continued. As I was saying, before I was so rudely interrupted, I think we are all reasonable versions of ourselves. Well, all of us left anyway, and don't need to resort to anything as base as violence. Except for that idiot, of course. But why not talk about our issues and compromise like adults? I don't know, returned the monk. I consider myself a man of peace, and don't often get along with those who prefer violence. Or, if I'm being frank, with villains. Villain? I, sir, am no villain. I am a benevolent ruler of my world. I have brought peace, prosperity, and knowledge to all. I am the creator of a golden age of humanity. Uh-huh. And how many dissidents have you removed? Well, yeah, that's my point. You're not a hero, you're Dr. Doom. I have been called much worse. At this point, Bard Prime, over in a corner, quietly began singing, Did you ever know that you're my hero? And crying to himself. Anyway, back to my point. You don't have to agree with my methods to realize we have more potential working together than as individuals. Since many of us have spirit magic, and all of us, I would gather, are familiar with the multiverse, I propose a Transworld Council, or you might say a Legion of us. And thus the Legion of Bards was born, with the Dark Lord as chair, allowing Bard Prime to channel not only individual superheroes, but the alternate versions of himself as temporary empowerments. This would in no way come back to bite anyone, or give Bard identity issues. That guy was next up, and found himself facing an ancient version of himself, who kept up the time magic and had started jumping around the timeline like he had a blue police box. There was an anthropomorphic Yorkie, who was just happy to be here, and an anthropomorphic cat that clearly couldn't care less. The three others looked fairly normal, but through eldritch means that guy knew that one was an entropy mage. Of the other two, one started loudly shouting that magic wasn't real and, "Nurse, the visions are back!" Apparently, way back when Bard had drugged everyone to induce a magical awakening, in the first series, the neophyte iron goldfish of this timeline had quickly gotten in over their heads and were messily ripped to shreds in front of that guy, who had needed years of therapy to get better. The final that guy seemed to be just like his prime counterpart, except that, based on his comments, he took that guy's already edgy sense of humor to fully vile extremes. He made a lot of incidental comments that I can't repeat, but the gist of it was to call the panicky, magic-denying that guy's mother a whore. The old one, busily stroking the cat's head, pointed out that they all had the same mother, and the racist said, "Yeah, that's how I know." That guy Prime, meanwhile, went over to the dog's self and started to pet him behind the ears, which was much appreciated. While the racist was ranting and raving, and everyone else was edgily staring at themselves, the entropy mage reached out and stole a chunk of the racist's luck. Specifically, his luck at RPG dice rolls. You see, that guy had notoriously bad rolls at all tabletop RPGs. He always rolled low, unless he was supposed to do so, in which case he rolled high. Turns out, that was because Entropy Guy had been reaching out across the multiverse and stealing his alternate selves' luck at dice rolls. Not to go to Vegas, or win lots of money, or gamble, or anything actually sensible, this idiot just wanted to win every D&D game. You know, a game that you can't actually win. Evil doesn't always mean smart. Anyway, Racist Guy managed to notice when Dice Guy stole some of his luck, and after a minute or two of pondering, along with a stream of consciousness rant about minorities, put two and two together. With a shout of, "It's you! You're the reason I suck at games!" He fired a non-lethal bolt of static electricity at the thief. He started railing about stolen dice rolls, and Prime Guy paused. "You're the reason I suck?" Moving slowly and keeping both Racist Guy and Dice Guy in view, Prime Guy pulled out a D10 and rolled it. It came up a 9. Racist turned to the thief and shouted, "Oh, you dick!" while the entropy mage smirked. More accusations were hurled, and a few more experiments were rolled, with similar results. Finally, the racist had had enough and charged the dice sucker, only to realize that technically more than his luck with dice had been stolen when he completely missed his target and managed to somehow break his own nose with the haymaker. While this was all going on, Anti-Magic Guy began talking about what his therapist said to do when you meet multiversal versions of yourself. They're there to teach you something, and you should ask what they mean. So he did, wandering around and asking what each of the alternate selves were there to teach him. Old Guy pointed out that this was all real, but given that the therapist had prepared him for this exact scenario, he sounded very thorough, and Anti-Magic should probably book another appointment soon. Anti-Magic Guy stalwartly ignored this, and kept wandering around telling everyone that he recognized their importance, and please, what did they mean? He didn't approach the two combatants, but was mostly ignored until he got to Dog Guy, who was happy to get some pets. From anybody, really. This helped calm him down some, and prevented a full-on freakout. Once it was all over, the other that guys took pity on the poor man and told him it was all a dream, and it meant he should definitely get a dog. Anti-Magic Guy accepted this, and his unstable psyche held together for the moment. Back at the combatants, if such a term can be applied to what was basically a two-man Three Stooges routine, they quickly devolved into a slap fight. Bad luck at D&D being enough to prompt a punch-up, sure, but not actually full-on attempted murder. Finally, sick of all this nonsense, and of the old man tossing out insults Statler and Waldorf style, Dice Sucker pushed the racist back to create some breathing room, pulled his phone, and unleashed a huge blast of bad luck. His victim felt it and immediately froze, apparently under the assumption that luck operates like a T-Rex from Jurassic Park. He even said, "If I don't move, nothing bad will happen," thereby voicing the idea out loud and jinxing himself. This might have worked if he wasn't dealing with magic. From out of thin air, a version of Bard strolled into the room smoking a cigarette, or cigarette-looking item. He waved at everyone as he walked past, then casually flicked the still burning smoke behind him as he walked through one of the passageways. Of course, this landed on the racist shirt, and he spontaneously combusted. The assorted that guys were nice enough to put him out, but the fight was definitely out of him. This done, the other that guys decided they didn't really want to fight. They sent the racist and anti-magic versions home, and then turned to Dice Sucker. The others revealed they'd known what he was doing the whole time, but were having fun gaslighting racist guy. But given that they may or may not be in a game, meta gaming being kind of literal in a multiverse situation, if so, the Dice Sucker had a higher calling. He needed to go find whichever universe was the one where everyone was playing around a table, and replace that version of that guy with someone who could actually roll a success. He agreed to this noble calling, and not getting beaten up by his alternate selves/victims, which he so richly deserved, and went off to search the multiverse, while that guy Prime pointed out that the dog was clearly the best version of him, because dogs are always the bestest boys, or girls. As such, Dog Guy should probably be the one to go forward and make the Imperium a more lovable place. No one commented on that guy's new hirsute look when he joined the rest of the party, probably deciding not to look a gift horse in the mouth. Although the slightly different Welshie drew tons of remarks, oddly enough, but once we figured out his Pennsylvania was still there, he was dubbed the Good Welshie. Finally, Weeb walked into his slice of the webway to see his alternate selves. Two of them walked into the arena, saw everyone, and pulled some sort of magical stunt to nope the hell out before they could even be identified. The others watched them go, slightly puzzled. They all looked pretty much the same, although one had a large, ornate cloak and a vest with numerous pockets. The only outlier was one that could only be called aggressively androgynous. It looked at the others a moment, then said, "Oh, I used to be a guy. I remember now." Turns out this was a shapeshifter life mage who embodied Weeb's inner horniness. He called it Incubus Weeb. This one had apparently had sex with literally every consenting adult person on their planet. You would think this would lead to all the STDs, but in fact, with life magic, sex with Incubus Weeb actually cured you of everything, from AIDS to the common cold. Magic is neat. As everyone sized themselves up, Weeb Prime glanced around and said, "Okay, everyone, you know what we need to do. If you're me, we've been planning this for years. You," he pointed to one, and the alternate started to hum a bass line. He pointed to another, and they added a high note. Then he started, "I wanna be the very best," point, "like no one ever was. Bom, bom, bom." This was done by all in 5-part harmony. They then proceeded to spend a full hour singing childhood theme songs and other favorites. This is because, even among a party of huge nerds, Weeb is a colossal dork. After that, there wasn't really any fighting, because Weeb also has a fairly healthy self-image. Prime suggested that they could fuse and combine powers, DBZ style, but a few objected, stating that they had business to handle back in their own universes. In particular, the one with the cape explained that he used matter and prime magic to bring his painted miniatures, mostly of Space Marines and Pokemon, to life and use them to, quote, deal with troublesome elements. Some later pressing from our multiversal connected mages determined that he was closely aligned with the Doctor Doom-esque bard, and that they mostly targeted politicians, oligarchs, tycoons, and other would-be world rulers. Because every CEO thinks they're untouchable, till one of them takes a Bulbasaur to the head. The other Weebs agreed that Miniatures Weeb was doing important work and shouldn't be disturbed, and maybe scheduled a time for him to take a sabbatical to some of their own dimensions. Eventually, it was agreed that, since time wasn't really an issue, according to Chegorok anyway, they could spend some time chatting and teaching each other magical tricks. Also, Incubus Weeb agreed to bond with Prime, letting them switch control Yu-Gi-Oh!/Jujutsu Kaisen style, but with less murder and more horniness. And so, having dealt with ourselves and seen what might have been, the winning mages each moved out of their own arenas, down a short hallway, and emerged into a large opening in front of massive doors and the Laughing God. Before we could worry too much about what had just happened, and why we felt more powerful, enlightened, and or confused, the Eldari deity gave a dramatic bow and said, "Welcome, honored humans, to the Black Library. Remember, no talking, and don't summon any demons larger than your head." End of Chapter 5. thank you everyone for listening. I hope you enjoyed this one. This has been about the past 2 months of gaming, and it's been a whole lot of fun. I had the idea as a way for us to get another dot of arete, move from 3 to 4th dots, and you will, in some of the next videos, you will see just how freaking ridiculous 4 dots are. We, as part of it and part of, multiverse and silliness, everybody had to design 6 alternate universe versions of themselves at roughly the same power level, and then hand out, everybody played themselves fighting themselves. And then each person, they got to say like, oh, I want that guy to play the drunk version of me or whatever. And, kind of everybody got to pick parts and have fun playing one of our friends. And it was a blast. Very little actually just like punch-ups, mostly talking to ourselves because we're apparently more psychologically healthy than that, I guess. Or at least some of us. But it was very neat, and it was a lot of unexpected compromises and solutions that were completely appropriate. I think I've mentioned I'm Bard, and, appropriate for the storyteller. And my friends came up with like, yeah, if you met alternate versions of yourself, you would definitely start a Legion of Doom just populated by you. And it made me so happy because it's absolutely true. And we all got to have that and have some fun with it. And it was a real blast. And we came out of it. Our characters much more powerful and us having had a real good time. So I hope you enjoyed the silliness and the shenanigans. Be with us next time for Fun with Elves. Hope to see you then. Take care. Bye.